All right. Good morning, Doug. Today, there's lots of things we could talk about, but we're going to focus on this article you shared with me that came in the New York Review of Books, which is a very left-wing publication that you first turned me on to, maybe I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. They have amazing stuff in there all the time. But what's this article that you saw, and what was it that got your attention about it?
Yeah, well, of course, I usually have to apologize in some way for subscribing to the New York Review. I also subscribe to the London Review of Books, which is maybe even more leftist. Uh, this all adds up to proof that the communists and socialists and progressives totally control not just academia, but the publishing business and the intellectual space generally, because the New York Review is basically about left-wing intellectuals that absolutely own the popular publishing space, talking to each other about other leftist intellectuals. That's basically what it is. It's like a private cafe clutch, but they're smart. They have a lot of data, and I do enjoy the articles on book reviews on, books of some import, books on science or books on history. But so many of the books that are reviewed in these various reviews are necessarily now by women and people of color and things like that. But you can discard that anyway. It's a bad habit, and I'm sorry I got you into it.
I don't know, but it's very interesting because I think one of the things we always have to watch out for is that we get siloed in our thinking. I mean, we need intellectual dexterity, and the only way we can keep that up is by being exposed to people who think, and smart people who think fundamentally differently than you. And I think it's very valuable.
Yes, and this article in particular, which is called Reality Rebellion by Mark Danner, in the last, the June 1st edition. I'm so glad I read it because it was just shocking. I mean, it seems like these people live actually in a different reality. So perhaps it's well titled, where it's called Reality Rebellion is the name of it. So the first thing that I made note of here in going through the article is Mr. Danner says, workmen have stripped the barbed wire from around the Capitol. The shattered windows have been replaced. The blood has been scrubbed away. I mean, this is the tone of the whole article. It was like he was trying to make it out like it was Berlin in 1945. But
right. And I think that the big thing about all of this to me, and just kind of the big picture around it, was that he makes a compelling case. If you knew nothing about what if you weren't an American, but instead this were written about, like, maybe what happened recently in Myanmar and about the coup in Myanmar, and I didn't have any other knowledge other than the information that was given to me essentially within this article, I would believe it, because he makes a really compelling case that not only and I think it's totally insane, and I totally disagree with it, but not only did an actual coup attempts take place on January 6th, but it's been brewing for a while. It was led by Trump completely, and that there's much work to be done, very urgent work for the national security apparatus, essentially, to take it seriously.
That's right. And the article is also very valuable to help one psychologically discount what they read about political situations anywhere, because as you pointed out, somebody who's never been to the US would assume in a prestigious publication like this that it's an accurate recantation of what actually happened. Okay, so, but it's not. So anyway, Danner goes on to say, the coup did not succeed in overturning the election. The coup that did not succeed in overturning the election goes unpunished. More than 400 of its foot soldiers have been arrested, but its instigator remains at large. I presume that's Trump, the instigator that he's talking about. Because he
Exactly. And exactly. And these foot soldiers, later he refers to them as stormtroopers, you know, and it's as if, like, you look at some of these pictures of these lost, you know, grandparents walking through the Capitol with a little American flag, you know, staying in between the ropes, and you're like, you know, I think history is being rewritten essentially at this point. That's what, and this is a very good effort to do it.
Well, it's long been said that the victors write the history. And clearly in the intellectual space, not just these two magazines I mentioned, the London and New York reviews of books, but the Atlantic and the New Yorker and all of them, they're all populated totally and absolutely by hardcore leftists that take exactly this view. So, you know, somebody that wasn't actually in the Capitol and didn't think about it, well, I guess they believe this is what happened.
Mhm.
So what else goes on here? That next thing I quoted in this is the attempted coup of January 6th destroyed two cardinal principles of American politics. First says that we choose who holds power, not through violence, but through elections. Well, yeah, okay, that's good. The second says that when one party wins an election, the other accepts the result and forms a loyal opposition while it waits the chance to win the next time. Okay, I guess that's true too. Those are accurate,
But it appears they weren't present for the last, for the 2016 election, because that certainly didn't seem to happen. They weren't the loyal opposition to Trump.
exactly the point I was going to bring up. So the pot's calling the kettle black, as it were. So, you know, these people live in a bubble. Of course, we all live in a bubble. I admit that I live in a bubble. We all do, in our own silos, as it were. So, and he goes on to other things that would be kind of interesting to see him expand upon. It's that in order to claim the presidency after the deadlocked election of 1876, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the defeated South and, in effect, end Reconstruction. It was a dark bargain. Well, the first part of that is accurate. That's what happened. But he calls it a dark bargain that federal troops were withdrawn from the South. I mean, I guess progressives wanted to see the North have a military occupation of the South for God knows how many more years.
Yeah, I think people don't understand that after the Civil War, the period that followed the Civil War, you know, the kind of the oppression of the southern states by federal troops, essentially, how that actually occurred in, you know, in some cities. And maybe can you just give like the 3 or 4 minute overview on that? Because I think that a lot of people don't understand that part of American history at all.
Well, I guess we have to start with the Civil War, which we've talked about this before, but not everybody listens to all these things. And I think this is a very important point to make. It's that it should not be called the Civil War to start with, because the Civil War is one where two or more parties are attempting to gain control of the same government in the same territory. It was not a civil war by that definition, which is an accurate definition. It was a war of secession, where one group simply wanted to part company from the other group. From that point of view, the American Revolution was actually a war of secession, among other things. It was also a civil war, it turned out, because, but anyway, it's a war of, it was a war of secession, number one. And even today, race relations are much, much better in the South than they are in the North, actually, because there weren't many blacks in the North, which made it real easy for Northerners to say they disapproved of slavery, which incidentally had really nothing to do, it's anathema to say this, but the Civil War, the war between the states, technically more correct name for it, was not about slavery, because Abraham Lincoln, who could have abolished slavery anytime he wished with an executive order. It wasn't abolished until the Emancipation Proclamation, which was, when was it? Very early in 1863. The war had been going on already for quite a while, more than a year and a half. The war was actually the reason the South seceded, which didn't necessitate a war, just seceding didn't necessitate a war. It was about the onerous taxes that they were paying most of, because in those days, about 75% of the income of the US government was from import duties. But the interesting thing is that the South, as an agrarian economy, was paying also about 75% of those import duties. Why? Because they didn't have manufacturing equipment, so they had to import from either Europe or the North. But European equipment was cheaper and better. But the North wanted them to buy their equipment. And so they were paying all these import duties, and they simply just didn't want to have to, in effect, be the North's bitch. So that's how it really all started. It was about economics, which is what most wars are basically about. And then you have this other issue about slavery, where people in both the North and the South, there was a lot of agreement that it was morally reprehensible. And the last major country in the world to abolish slavery was Brazil, only 20 years later. And even England had only abolished slavery like 60 years before. So it was ending all over the world, just again as a matter of economics, because slave labor was proving to be uneconomic with the rise of industrial equipment to do dog work, basically. So the whole war was unnecessary, and it was about Lincoln not wanting to see it happen on his watch. So I blame the war on the War of Southern Secession entirely on Abraham Lincoln, who's by far the most overrated president that we've ever had. He's been apatheticized, of course.
He has. But then the Reconstruction efforts afterward were, I mean, it's the way it's positioned, the way I remember learning about it in middle school was that it was an effort to rebuild the South. You know, but and that, obviously Lincoln was dead by then, so Grant was really driving that effort, right?
Well, was it about rebuilding the South, or was it about socially re-engineering the South? That's what it was really about, because the South wasn't rebuilt by the North. I mean, carpetbaggers, Northern carpetbaggers who didn't care about the Southerners or their society or anything else, came in to exploit it to the greatest degree that they could. They weren't friendly altruists. So the whole thing was a completely unnecessary catastrophe. And as I said, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and so forth was, once again, basically fomented by the Northerners coming in and appointing or making sure that a lot of totally unqualified ex-slaves were elected to serious positions of power. And of course, the whites resented that. It was a racial thing.
Right. So sorry, I sidetracked you so much here, but basically I just want so basically he was equating, or there was a bargain essentially in a presidential election where the South would go along with the election if the North agreed to withdraw troops. And that's what he's saying was the dark bargain.
Yeah, I would say that's right. I think he wanted to see, Mr. Danner would have liked to have seen the North continue occupying the South, because he kind of hates the South.
Well, it seems like, as he starts off this whole article, he says, that no one yet has been punished. And it seems like, that occupation of the South was really, in that vein. It was about punishing.
Yeah, which brings up another question. Does punishment really do anything. If a crime, an actual crime has been committed, punishment doesn't serve much of a useful purpose. What does serve a useful purpose is if you can prove that it was an actual crime with destruction of life or property committed, there ought to be recompense on the part of the offender.
Right.
Punishment is, well, that's vindictive. I can understand punishment, but recompense is much better. But who was damaged? Certainly the North wasn't damaged by anything that was going on in the South. The whole thing is crazy. Nobody thinks this stuff out. Anyway, what's next here? Loyal opposition. Okay, we've covered that. The next thing I have, I could stop at almost any sentence in this article, which runs about 23 computer pages. But the next thing we got, see, we do not know, Mr. Danner says, because there has been no thorough public investigation of what's happened, what went on there. Well, that's certainly true. I don't know that there has been.
Right.
You know, all this seems to be happening. And of course, what do I know, or what does anybody else know about what's happening? All we know is what's on television or is in the mass media. But it appears that about 400 people have been arrested. I don't know how many of them are being held, under what conditions, on what charges, and why they can't get bail, because this whole thing was nothing but what's the crime, if any, that was committed? Well, possibly trespass and disorderly conduct in the case of some people, no doubt about that. But the one actual instance of violence, armed violence, was when a Capitol cop, as yet unidentified, killed that woman who was idiotically crawling through a window into
Window.
Yeah, so to me, this is a potential case of second-degree murder on the part of that. You know, he obviously wasn't threatened by a woman crawling through the window. I mean, this is why they have mace or police batons to, you know, push her back. She had no right to do that, obviously. But
yes.
That was, so they've
Well,
got
even
this upside down.
Yeah, well, even in fact, behind her, there were Capitol Police with with ARs. I mean, so in riot gear that were standing right behind her in the hallway. So she was, or at least they were standing on the staircase right behind her, as some of the video footage showed. So yeah, it doesn't seem like that. It doesn't seem like it was a necessary kill. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's an understatement. So it appears that badly disciplined Capitol cop is going to skate when he should be prosecuted and pay compensation to her family, at least for what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he says quite correctly, there's no thorough public investigation of what happened. Supporters of the former president within the political system have thus far worked hard to block such an investigation. Wait a minute, I thought that the Republicans, who were basically the members of that crowd, would be anxious for an investigation. And everything I read, and they want an investigation because they feel unjustly prosecuted. So he's got it upside down and totally backward. Is that the way you read it?
Well, I think what he's referring to is the fact that there was an attempt to put together a 9/11-like commission, and like Mitch McConnell and others, voted against that effort. So the refusal to appoint this 9/11 style commission, I think, is where is what he's referring to. But again, with the 9/11 commission, like, that was just a total disaster. I mean, that it was all misdirection. It wasn't an investigation anyway.
Yeah, but very much like the investigation of the Kennedy assassination.
Exactly.
Possible perpetrators on the, I mean, it's all a charade. It's all kabuki theater, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I guess insofar as Republicans like McConnell block the investigation. Well, yeah, okay, he's a Republican, I guess, but he's really a member of the deep state. And the problem that people have with this is it was a matter of pissed off average Americans, in effect, rioting against the deep state. So
Right.
anyway, what's next here? The most striking evidence was a 13-minute film setting out the events of the day. What film is that in particular? Do you know that he's referring to? He doesn't identify.
No, I know that there was some news footage and some there was this 13 minutes of footage that they put together. They presented at the second impeachment trial or hearing for Trump after he was already out of office, and just kind of showing the worst events, I guess, of the protesters, where they were pushing against police and they were breaking into windows, breaking into the building itself. So it was it's a selectively edited, compelling piece of footage that just shows that there was some general mayhem going on there, which there was.
Yeah, well, I guess you can put together a 13-minute film at any gathering, like at any ball game, frankly. There's got to be 13 minutes worth of disorderly conduct and nastiness.
No doubt.
So, not very objective. Anyway, next thing I've got is the Watergate hearings were able to achieve, that in part because so many prominent Republicans accepted the story shaped by congressional. So he talks about the Watergate hearings, and nobody talks about Watergate anymore, which is good in a way because it occurred. Although I see Nixon as one of the worst presidents this country's ever had, basically a criminal personality, professional politician. But what did he do, or was he in back of? It was a minor break-in into the other party to see what they were doing, steal some documents. That's what it was all about. Kind of a big nothing in the big picture of things, where today's government is sending people off to black sites and killing who knows how many people with drones and special ops soldiers. I mean, who knows it was a minor break-in. So it's not like a major thing. I mean, I guess the consequence of it was good in that Nixon was taken out of office, but it was blown out of all proportion. Anyway, he brings it up. It was an achievement to have done that. Anyway, it's just where he's coming from. What else is here? So we go down and it says, so he's talking now about the quote unquote rioters. And he says, to them, every new regulation smacks of tyranny. Well, I'd say in principle, that's an accurate statement. Every new regulation, in fact, does smack of tyranny. Every new tax is an illegal taking. Well, I guess the key word there is illegal. So if you make a law making it legal, it's no longer a theft, taking.
Right.
Yeah, but it actually is theft, just under a legal disguise. Any new executive order limiting the purchase of firearms will be the beginning of a totalitarian regime they know is coming. Okay. Well, I think a totalitarian regime is well on the way. I mean, that's been the trend in the US for decades. And perhaps when there's a new executive order, if it's serious enough about the purchase or use of firearms, yeah, so it's accurate, but it's his attitude towards these things. I mean, he wants to see all this stuff happen.
He does, and I think one of the biggest things he's trying to do is he's trying to establish the idea that there is a large, 40% of the electorate, or something like that, that is convinced that that Biden is an illegitimate president, that they stole the election, and that essentially you aren't going to dispel them essentially of these myths, and that everything that actually happens in reality that the Biden administration does, what she thinks is all in good faith, all of those things just will prove to be to serve as evidence to this very large swath of the population. They believe that just that Trump was right, and that Trump, that their basic beliefs about the country going going to hell essentially is proved correct.
Yeah. And the next thing I've got is that he says about them, but many of them believe that the Constitution, in its provision for citizens to, quote unquote, keep and bear arms, provides for precisely this kind of violent rebellion against a tyrannical government. Well, the Constitution does not provide for this kind of a violent rebellion, which it wasn't, against a tyrannical government, which increasingly is. What he really should be referring to is the actual founding document of the United States, which is the Declaration of Independence, where in many, I don't have it to quote here, but yeah, it was about why there should be a violent rebellion against a tyrannical government. So it's the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. So he's kind of accurate in what he says, but he's referring to the wrong damn document that has nothing to do with it. So it's all intellectually dishonest, which is, of course, what these leftists specialize in. And what's next? I'm just going randomly to things that I underlined. The new president has led quietly and efficiently, seeing a nationwide vaccination program and the passing of trillions of dollars of aid to Americans who have suffered during the pandemic. Well, you see what he likes there. I mean,
yeah,
a nationwide vaccination program. Why bring that up? I guess he's saying Biden must be good because he's
exactly.
Yeah.
It's counted as a big success. I think, and of course they have to ignore the fact that that Trump, was a supporter of Operation Warp Speed to bring the vaccines out, which of course I wish he was not. I wish he had nothing to do with that. I wish, he'd, but because I think it's all a mistake. But yeah, so he's just talking about how Biden is good, and the next sentence after they said the old era of scandal and conflict and bluster has receded. We appear to have returned to a kind of normalcy. Like that Biden has brought back respect to the office or whatever.
It's all a lie. And then just above that, he says, passing trillions of dollars of aid to Americans who suffered during the pandemic. Well, Americans got some table scraps, $600 here, $1,200 there, but the trillions of dollars basically went to the corporations, members of the deep state. So once again, it's a subtle diversion and lie. Let's see, it goes on here. Gets a little bit more radical actually as it goes on. The decadence of the old white and institutions they built is a worldwide phenomenon. It encompasses the collapse of mainstream parties in France and Germany, Great Britain's Brexit, and other fault lines yawning in the European Union. Well, that's an interesting point. It's, is it the decadence of the old elite and institutions they built? Or I'm not sure what we call the election of, very dictatorially oriented people like Modi in India. A right-wing version would be Bolsonaro in Brazil. A left-wing version is the Kirchners, or the Fernandezes actually, in Argentina. It seems like there's lots of interesting things going on all over the world today, very much like in the 30s. You had the popular election of Mussolini and of Hitler, and the cementing of Stalin in office, Roosevelt, who was really a totalitarian, very much in the mode of these other types, Peron and Argentina. So maybe the prevailing winds today are not dissimilar from the early 1930s with a booming economic collapse too.
Well, that's a disconcerting idea, because that didn't lead to a lot of peace and prosperity in the short term.
No, eventually these people all had to duke it out with each other. So anyway, he makes an observation there that's, kind of, let's see, the last circle of hell, treachery by the people, from the people, and against the people. Well, here he's, of course, doing a takeoff on Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, government by the people, for the people. What's the rest of it? The Gettysburg Address says, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Well, I don't believe that. The government is today basically by the, by the guys that are what we call the deep state, which amounts to about, I don't know how many there are, a couple thousand, 5,000 people that are really top dogs in the government and the corporations and the banks and things like that pull all the strings. But it's a lie to say that it's a democracy of the people, by the people, for the people, which this is a takeoff of. But he's just. But then he says after that, taken literally, it would mean that not a single pillar of our institutions deserves to be left standing. That's interesting, because I think by the time this is all over, the US is going to be totally transformed. I think that's likely.
Well,
things evolve naturally. Things always change, but okay. And then it's talking. So then he cries out against the concept of a deep state, just apparent he doesn't believe exists. So I guess that's because he wants to be a member of it. Everybody in and around Washington wants to be a member of it. Talking about Trump later, it says he golfs, receives supplicants, issues the occasional statement. Well, all presidents golf, I thought. From Obama to Eisenhower. And they all receive supplicants because he's still a powerful guy, can dispense favors, issues. It's just a snarky attitude of all articles on this type of thing. Weeks after the insurrection, but it wasn't an insurrection. It was a case of disorderly conduct. Weren't they these people saying that it was the Capitol is the people's house? So sorry it got out of control, but when you get 50,000 people together in an unorganized mob, which it was, there's no indication there was any leadership behind it. Yeah, of course, it's disorderly.
Well, I think this guy's main point is that there was, in his view, there was leadership behind it. That leadership was Trump. And then they have the stormtrooper-like organizations, which he refers to a little later on, the Oath Keepers. And
well, then he goes on to Trump, saying that Trump could destroy the institutions of the country by starting a third party. And I don't know if he actually will or not, or just try to take over the Republican Party. But just as a comment, whether this can be pulled off or not, the Republican Party is clearly divided into two factions. The vast majority support cultural traditionalism, which is what Trump represents. And then you've got the deep state guys in it that run the Republican Party at all levels. So
exactly.
Will he start a third one? It's hard to say. Third parties have never been successful, but he might be able to pull it off.
But the thing is, he's been so neutralized now. This is one of the things that I find very funny about this article and others that are basically pointing their finger at Trump still. I mean, he has been effectively black memory hold in so many ways. And maybe not the memories of him there, but he would have a larger active role in what's happening today if he were dead, I think. If he had died, like I think that his memory would be, but he's alive and he's not able to communicate. They won't put him on TV. Sometimes, occasionally on, you know, the non-primetime Fox, they'll put him on a couple places. He's banned from Twitter, banned from Facebook. You know, it's people who post his press releases get banned from Twitter. I mean, it's like he doesn't exist anymore. I mean, he's gone. He's irrelevant now. So I don't know. I don't think he has that power. I think he's the ghost that people use.
I think you're right. And we were both talking to a mutual friend who, what he does is he just travels around the country with his Airstream, and very gregarious guy, likes to meet people, likes to talk to everybody, highbrows, hipsters, everybody. And he's of the opinion that the average guy in the heartland of the country is very pissed off at what's going on right now. Very, very restive.
I think that's true.
So will Trump start a third party? I don't know. Will the Democrats, who all basically share the same philosophy? It's just that AOC is much more outrageous and radical than Nancy Pelosi, but they share the same philosophy. So maybe that won't break up. But the Republican Party certainly could. So what else is going on here with this guy? He calls Trump later the supreme artist of hate and fear. But there's no objective proof that Trump deals in hate and fear. I mean, I don't see it, but maybe that's because of the goggles that I look through.
Yeah, I don't see it at all. I just think, but that is the narrative. That has been the narrative from day one about him, that he is a racist, that he, you know, I mean, you think that he's a warmonger or a war criminal like Cheney or something, you know, but it's part of the narrative. It's built in already. The left it's clearly there. They couldn't imagine it not existing.
No, I mean, Trump has serious faults, but he's not the supreme artist of hate and fear. I mean, it's a ridiculous statement on its face. So going on down here, he says, oh yeah, he brings up the Arizona vote audit, which is put in quotes, and other spurious recounts to come. I don't know, you probably follow this more closely than I do, but there's nothing wrong with having an audit after the fact if people think that something was wrong.
Well, in fact, it's a part of the legal framework that it happens. You know, that it's not like it's actually happening in because the law requires it under certain circumstances for it to happen. So it's not like outside of the realm of what's normal or what would normally happen. I think what's outside of the norm is some of the things that they're finding. You know, the last article I read on was like 200,000 missing ballots in Maricopa County in Arizona, and that's a big deal. So, but I love that he's referring to these things this way. He says like that these pseudo events, he calls them, you know, that happen in the real world are necessary for these crazy, rabid, you know, white nationalist probably people to believe the narrative, believe that, you know, the country's been stolen. So they have to have these pseudo real world events in order to help them support their beliefs that this is true.
Well, one thing that seems for certain is that there's not, nor I doubt there will be, any even-handed, objective, as far as you can be, reporting on why that audit's taking place and what the results of it are. I mean, it's an information blackout. Nobody knows anything other than, you know, some inflammatory opinions that are doled out. It's part of the breakdown of US culture, where the average American at this point, and I don't care if that means a left-wing American or a right-wing American, actually doesn't believe anything anymore. And institutions can't function if nobody believes anything. Or both sides accuse the other side, in some cases correctly, of conspiracy theories, which are unfounded. I mean, that's not the way that's not the way a peaceful society can function. It can't.
Right. No one believes anything anymore. And actually, you're an idiot if you do accept the given truth, consistently. I mean, you're obviously an idiot.
I completely agree, because I don't believe anything that I hear, or I examine it and I'm forced to parse it
Exactly.
very closely. But then he goes on to say, terrorism expert Malcolm Nance he said that Trump is going to lead a political insurgency that will have a paramilitary insurgent element. The insurgent element is the violent vanguard of those Trump voters animated by white nationalism and racial resentment. Well, this is complete nonsense. I mean, yeah, I think there are a lot of Americans that don't like the fact that the culture in the US is changing, that we've gone from, the average American being, supporting flag, the apple pie, Chevrolet, and baseball, to now, massive amounts of immigrants from alien cultures, alien in race and ethnicity and customs and language and religion. Yeah, okay. Is that white nationalism to be concerned about your culture being washed away? I'd say no. And racial resentment. It's not about race, it's about ideas. I mean, speaking for myself, I would much rather live in a community of Black people that I shared values with than white people like the guy writing this article.
Exactly. Race is an irrelevant factor, but it's a way to drive a deep wedge between individuals. And the biggest thing I think the deep state has to have is it has to have wedges driven between groups of people. You have to have resentment between them. The interesting thing about this is that this article goes along with who was it? Somebody at the not the Attorney General, maybe it was the Attorney General, coming out saying that I think on May 12th, around that date, that the greatest terrorist risk that America faced was from white nationalists. And and the biggest threat to America was white nationalists. Now, of course, at the same time, we just heard from Biden the other day, the greatest threat to the United States is actually climate change. But it's been well positioned that this is a real thing and we should be very worried about it.
Yeah, I guess they're saying the COVID hysteria will perhaps blow over. Well, it should have blown over already. But if it's not one thing, it's something else. It's always something, as Gilda Radner used to say. He goes on to say the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys are just a few of the better known paramilitary organizations that acted violently on January 6th. There's absolutely no proof whatsoever for that statement that I know of.
I have not seen any evidence of that either. And I don't even I mean, there must be a very low bar to be a paramilitary organization these days, Doug. I always imagine like the Sandinistas or some group like that, as a paramilitary organization, not a bunch of guys in Hawaiian shirts.
And wouldn't Antifa be a closer fit to a paramilitary organization?
Well, they would if they existed, Doug, but they don't exist. So it's not, they can't possibly qualify.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And Black Lives Matter is just turning into a financial scam more than anything else.
Yeah.
So anyway, what's the next thing that he says here? Well, he says the movement, referring to Trump and all these people, brings together conservatives, Christian nationalists, Nazi sympathizers, white supremacists, and ultra-nationalist groups such as the Proud Boys. conservatives. I mean, they're being classed with Nazi sympathizers. That
Exactly.
doesn't make sense. Christian nationalists. I guess, what is that? People that,
Believe in Jesus and America.
yeah, I guess that's what that is. White supremacists. I don't know any white supremacists. I mean,
No.
I really don't. I mean, ultra-nationalist groups such as the Proud Boys, are they ultra-nationalist?
What does that mean?
I don't know. What's the difference between an ultra-nationalist and an ordinary nationalist?
Yeah, it's almost.
They don't want to start a war in a place. That's not what they're about.
No, in fact, the Proud Boys, if I recall, was originally just a drinking group, like a fraternity type of a thing, that then ended up evolving into something that was a reaction to Antifa.
That's right. It's just a bunch of guys that were tired of being pushed around and shamed because of their skin color. That's all I ever saw.
Yeah.
With them. So, but you got to say these things about members of these violent groups. No indication of that, and no mention of BLM or Antifa.
Well, except for the next part, which is very interesting, the way that the BLM is positioned here. So if it says the main long-term impact of the violence launched against the Black Lives Matter protests last May and June might be its radicalizing effect on a tiny minority of participants who join more violent groups as a result. Now, I don't remember violence being launched against the Black Lives Matter protests last May or June. Do you?
No, and with the reporting having been so pro BLM, if there were white mobs coming out against them, that certainly would have been reported, but there wasn't any.
Right, but he makes this assertion as though this is just adding this in. This is part of the body of history that that we'll refer to in the future.
That's exactly right. And in the future, when when everybody now is dead and buried, they'll research articles like this, because this guy says that he was on the spot. I think someplace in here he says he was there at the riots, so it's firsthand reporting. And this is how history gets written,
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of history is lies. You have to be so careful reading history. What else is there? It just goes on with lots of rhetoric. How many such dedicated armed revolutionaries are there now in the country? Surely they number in the hundreds, if not the thousands. Well, I don't know. There's hundreds of absolutely anything. I mean,
right.
I understand. I have no idea if this is true, but apparently there are tens of thousands of flat Earth people in the country.
There are some that show up in our comments all the time. So yes.
I hate to insult the intelligence of any of our subscribers, but no, it actually is around Earth. I think there's plenty of evidence for that. But surely they number in the hundreds. Well, out of a country of 330 million people, I promise there are more than hundreds of serial murderers running around too.
Probably.
So any worries about lone wolf operations and a leaderless resistance?
And he jumps right into basically the idea that there are these people who are very dedicated, and they're young people who basically believe in this movement that was started by Trump and is still sort of being, in their mind, this guy's mind, led by Trump. And that they want to make sure, he says, many of us in the movement, myself and a lot of other young people like me, he's quoting some young person here, I think theoretically at least, have come to grips with the fact that death is a reality. It's coming. We just want ours to count. And so he's saying, how many of these people are there? Surely it's hundreds, maybe thousands. And they now want to make their death count. What does that mean? Does that mean lone wolf attacks? Does it mean that they're going to be kidnapping political leaders? What acts of terrorism? He's just jumping into these assumptions, that these people, that there's these young, dangerous people that are willing to throw their life away for this cause of Trump.
It sounds to me like the FBI, perhaps in conjunction with the DEA and the domestic arm of the CIA and who knows how many other, they should put together a task force to root these people out and find out who they are and interrogate them.
Yes, and if necessary, rush them off to Guantanamo Bay where they can interrogate them with a free hand.
Yeah, or maybe a black site if Guantanamo Bay is overloaded with real and imagined terrorists.
Exactly.
So he says one need not be an expert in the history of terrorism and insurgency to see that the US is ripe for such a dynamic. Huh. Well, that's an assertion. He's not an expert in history of terrorism and insurgency, so that's a fair enough introduction. But is the US ripe for a real revolution? Which is he's basically saying here
Yes.
throughout. I don't know.
Well, I think that if we were talking about our mutual friends' interactions with people all over the country, just ordinary people, and how angry and frustrated they are, by at the failure of the institutions. I mean, I do think that some of this is correct. It's in that there really is real anger and there is frustration, and people don't know they believe that the political process didn't serve them, and and they believe that everything is being taken away from them. And I'll give you an example, like you said earlier, the things about America. You said baseball, apple pie, and something like that. And then, but another one that goes along with that was mom. And even mom, that word has been taken away from people. You're not allowed, it's a birthing person. And so I do think that people feel like they're being, surrounded on all sides in the culture war, if nothing else. And that all of a sudden now has a legal component to it with, the FBI kind of turning its attention internally, or the CIA, the intelligence services really turning their attention internally on domestic threats. So I think that pressure feels real.
I think you're right. The problem is it would be very bad for it to get violent because with the Bolsheviks controlling the military and the upper reaches of government and so forth. I mean, you can't win against the U.S. military. You just can't do it. It's foolish to try. They have concentration of force. It's total loser. The best thing, I think, for the people in the red state to do is non-cooperate and take a Gandhian approach to this type of thing. Peaceful resistance.
Exactly what I was going to say. Yep.
Yeah, because they can't arrest everybody. And I think, although the average cop and soldier follow orders, that's what they do, they're bound to get disgusted if they see that these people just want to be left alone as opposed to trying to kill them.
Right.
So that's the best kind of revolution. But I think we're headed for a revolution of some type in this country. I think he's right about that. But the country that he wants to see replace what we now have, that's what the revolution is going to be all about, if it comes. So, how does he wind this thing up? At the United States Capitol, after more than 4 months, the National Guardsmen have finally packed up and gone. Completely unnecessary that they were there. Members of Congress come and go as always, but now they must pass through magnetometers to make sure they are not bringing weapons into the floor of the House or Senate. It's kind of interesting. I guess what's that about?
The next sentence is really important here, Doug. You didn't highlight that, but it says, beyond the looming white building, the country has few magnetometers and a growing surge of political bitterness. And I think there he's stating the fundamental problem here. We have few control mechanisms, devices to measure, to protect, or whatever with these magnetometers, but the political bitterness is surging.
Yeah, and of course we wouldn't need all those magnetometers if guns were illegal. So that's all the more reason to illegalize them. And knives for that matter, because in Great Britain, my understanding is that you're not allowed to, well, it's questionable whether you can even own a kitchen knife, but certainly you can't carry on your person a knife with more than a 2-inch blade, I think.
Mm.
I think that's correct. So I'd really like to see everybody disarmed, totally,
Mhm.
absolutely, regardless of the fact that throughout history, one of the major distinctions between a free person and a slave was the right to be armed. Free man
Right.
could be armed. If you're a slave, you had no right to be armed in any way. So
Well,
we
one
end,
of the,
huh?
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say the last thing he says here. He says, need to be assured, can our democracy, he quotes, the president implored Congress, overcome the lies, anger, hate, and fears that have pulled us apart? I guess that's Biden. The plain answer is that there is as yet no sign that it can. Well, it's a lie on Biden's part. Well, yeah, there's plenty of, these things are yeah, it's all true. There's no sign that it can. Prognosis is poor.
Well, but it also seems like when there's not any real effort to try and get past any of these things either. It's divide and conquer across the board on everything. Everything is binary. You have to pick a side. You're an anti-vaxxer, or you're like everyone must vax, or you're an anti-masker, or you're whatever. And it just every issue. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. I mean, like, you know what I mean? It's just the framing of all of the ideas we're presented with is in a frame that is designed to simply divide everyone from everybody, to make everyone rudderless and rootless. And that just sows division and, angst and hatred and everything else.
Yeah, so in a way, Biden is right when he said lies, anger, hate, and fears. Yeah, which he's sowing. And the author, Danner, ends up his last sentence is all around us are signs that our angry politics are likely to grow angrier and perhaps more violent still. And presumably he's referring to the other side's politics, not his own. And it's signed June 3rd, 2021. So this is very up to date. I think he's right on that.
I think he is right on that, but just this whole thing is the predicate for having, the post 9/11 security state focused internally. I just think it's all about that, and it's not just him writing about this. There are others that are writing similar things, and certainly, the history about what happened on, on January 6th it's being solidified in people's minds that it was a coup, that it was bloody and violent, and they say that I think most liberals or most Democrats certainly believe that there was a Capitol Hill police officer beaten to death with a fire extinguisher. They believe that that's true, even though it's clear that wasn't the case. So, what can you do?
Well, if you control the media, I mean, you control people's beliefs and perceptions. So it looks kind of grim, actually. So what do we do about it? I can't think of anything to do except try to make sure that you're not too adversely affected by what's going on, which would mean, if you're going to live in the U.S., live in a mellow part of the country, and if you're in a position to do so, diversify internationally, politically, because your main risks today are political, even though the financial risks today are gigantic, as far as I'm concerned, anyway.
Yeah, they seem to go hand in hand. All right. Well, I think it's important that people do read things and expose themselves to things that are outside of their, the funnel that they live in. And I think that, going over this article, I'm sure a lot of people think it's insane, as, you and I both do, but it's important to understand how the whole narrative is being framed, because if you're gonna end up on one side or the other of it, sort of regardless if you're staying in the United States and you're participating in the political system. So it's important to know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it could be really grim. Well, we'll see what develops tomorrow and the next day, Matt.
We'll see. All right. Thank you very much, Doug. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay.